Hi, today I want to walk you through the basics of working with Wized. What is Wized? How does Wized work? And what can I build with Wized / how do I use Wized in my Webflow project? So the first thing you need to know is Wized is a logic layer that you put on top of your static Webflow site. Let me give you an example. So we have the Webflow site in here, right? And if we were to go to the preview right now, we see I cannot click on anything. It is not performing any action. It's just saying text and the button doesn't work, right? It is just a static website. But the moment I add Wized on top of that website, as you can see, I can interact with the elements and the elements change. We don't need to be too technical here, but for all the technical people watching this, let me show you. As we can see, if we were to go to this element in here, go to inspect elements, we will see that as I click on here, the element is updating. So I sadly cannot zoom in here, but you see this 40 in the site code? When I click on here, it is modifying the site code. You see it flash red in here. So what Wized is actually doing, it is when we build a website in Webflow, we get a static site code, right? We get the HTML, we get the CSS, we get some JS going on here. And Wized is taking the structure and adding its functionalities on there to modify the structure to make the page interactive and turn it from a static website into a web app. But this is not where Wized stops in modifying the HTML, because you can also run JavaScript in order to do that without having to know all the coding knowledge. So this, in a nutshell, is what Wized is. It is making your static page. It doesn't have any functionalities, as you can see here. I can click however many times I want and there nothing is happening. It's turning it into something interactive by modifying the site code, by interacting with the HTML Webflow gives you. And the way it's doing that is Wized is recognizing a lot of components on your website. So Wized needs to have some sort of identifier. We don't want Wized to perform the action when I click on the section or when I click on the text. So in order for Wized to add the logic on top of our Webflow site, we need to tell Wized what to do and how we want it to do it. And the way we're going to tell Wized what of those elements are relevant is using attributes. So if we click on, let's say, the button, for starters, we can add an attribute in here of Wized, and then we can name it however we want. We can do action button and we can add numbers in here, however you want to do that. We just need to add Wized in here. So Wized script will scrape the HTML of our site and look for, where is it saying Wized? Oh, here I gotta work with that's in my territory. It's saying Wized. So this is how Wized is recognizing the components that you want to work with Wized. And then you just need to give them a name. That name needs to be unique all the time, unless you want to have two components that do the same thing, because the name is the identifier for the component in Wized. Unless you want to have 2 times the same component, you can use 2 times the same identifier. So let's say you want to have another +1 button for whatever, so that when a pop-up is opened, they can still add +1. You can add that +1 button. If you want to do -1, you got to do a different button with a different attribute, maybe action button -1, for example, that will then be differentiable within the logic that Wized runs. So you need to do this unique. And the same thing for the text. So if you want to set text, in this case a number, you're just going to add a Wized attribute. Again, you go from style, this is your default in Webflow, you go to settings, you go to custom attributes right here. Maybe it is collapsed, so then you just expand it, and you just add again Wized text item. And the way I like to name my things is camel case. So the first word is lowercase, and then the first letter of the second word, the third word, and so on is always caps. You can also use client first styled naming approaches, but I just like it the way it is. That's just the best practices for JavaScript on the web. But since Wized is low code, we don't have to be too strict on that here. This is just the best practice to make sure that all browsers are working with it. Yeah, so as you can see, we have now our logic working in Wized because we already have some actions defined. So now let's actually delete both of those actions and refresh the canvas. Now we see nothing is working. So Wized is now recognizing that this is going on. And in order to interact with those components, we need to actually work with the components. And let's just build this from scratch. So let's actually create the variable. Let's actually delete the variable as well, because I want to show you how to make that. So first of all, we need to do a variable. Think of a variable like a little data store to store text or an array. So an array is a list, is a structure of items. So we need to create a variable to store data. Let's call this count because we just, not cont, it's count. And the default, we want this to start at 0. So we do return. We always need to write return, and then we do the value in here. And we do this as a computed variable because we want this to be updated instantaneous when the dependencies, the button click changes it. So now let's actually add the set text action so that this text will reflect the value, the 0 as of right now, in the variable. So let's go to the element, and here are now coming the attributes into play. So the attributes we have added in Webflow are now recognized by Wized, and only those. And we can now set the text, for example, for the text item using the set text action in this dropdown. We want to use plain text. We don't need to use HTML. We don't need to use Markdown. We want to do plain text here. And then we do return. You always got to do return. And we're now going into our variable selection here, and we're going to add the variable value. And now you see that text doesn't say set text anymore. It is reflecting in real time the value that is stored in our variable, which is a little data store for a text or a list structure. Now the +1 is still not working. So we need to work on some logic here using JavaScript. Don't get scared by this. The word JavaScript is way, way, way too intimidating here. I'm just talking about one line. And this is all the functionality you need. So let's call this +1 action. And we're going to go to an element action because we're targeting this element. This element will perform the logic. So we're going to go to our attribute selection, and we're going to select, we got the 0 already. We don't want it to run when we click on the 0, so we want to use the button. So we're targeting the button, and now we're going to actions on the setting. We're going to do on event. So on event, we want to use on click, and we want to do prevent default just for best practices. But prevent default is doing, for example, if you have a form, it's preventing that form is being submitted. Whatever default Webflow value or whatever default setting Webflow has, we're overriding it. It's very handy. It's just the best practice. Just always check that if you don't want to do a normal Webflow form submission in any case. And we're going to do run function. We could do set variable, but I just want to get you a bit more familiar with JavaScript in this video. So let's do a run function. Because you get more flexibility in working with run functions than in set variables. And while doing that, you learn more, and it only has benefits because the structure you already built is easier to extend as you want to increase your functionalities if you base those things on run functions. So now we need to think through the logic of this function. And the way I like to do that is I like to go visually through what I'm trying to do here. So let's go through it together. I have a 0 that is stored in the variable, right? And I want to click on this button and make it 1. And when this is now saying 1, I want to click again on here and it says 2. So I always want to do +1. So what we need to do is we need to look, the 0 here is tied to the variable. So what we want to do essentially is always add +1 to the current count of the variable. We always want to add 1 to the current variable. So the way we're going to do that is, first of all, we need to write return in the run function. That's how we have to start it in this case. And we just want to return, for test purposes, the 0, right? And if we were now to add +1, we would see we will get 1, right? So that updated. But it's not updating the variable, because we haven't said that we want the variable to equal the current count +1. We cannot just add +1 to the variable and return it, because then it will just return this variable +1, but not update the variable. What we need to do here is we need to do the variable equals the current variable +1. That way, when I run it, we will see the variable will be updated, because we need to say this variable will now equal this variable, which is null, which is 0, or it's not an empty value, so it's not null, which was 0 at the beginning, but it's 1 right now. So then this variable here will now equal whatever is in this variable right now +1, because the button is saying +1, so we wanted to do +1. And now this will do 2, this will do 3, 4, 5, and we're counting up. And the nice thing about Wized is, in this function editor, you can run the function here and see the preview. And if you're updating the variables accordingly, as we did in here, you're also going to see the live data in the data store. And you're also going to see this now reflected in the text, because the text is tied to the variable right here. You see, we set the text from the plain text from the v.count, which is the variable right here that we're interacting in the action. So we're not just interacting with the text component, we're interacting with a variable that is our data store across the whole page, and we're going to modify that, and the text will be a reflection of that. And yeah, this is the function. We just need to set it like this. And now, if we refresh this, we have a 0 in here. And when I click on +1, we have 1, +1 we have 2, and it's always counting up 1. And it's updating the variable while doing that, almost instantaneously. So now, as you can see, if I refresh the page, we're losing track of it. What you maybe want to do is you want to maybe do a session storage in Wized, so that when I add, let's go until 7, or let's do 13, and I refresh it, it will still show 13, because it is stored in the session. As long as this tab, as the session, is active on my browser, it will always return back. Now, if you want to save this for ages, you want to update the variable that is dependent on this value, in this case the count variable, to local storage. That way it is stored directly locally on the computer, and you can open this tab in 5 weeks if the cookie didn't expire, or if the variable didn't expire, and you can open this in weeks and it will still show the same. And you can open it in a new tab, and let's do this in this tab here. Let's go. And if I were to now copy this link and open it in another tab, it will still show the 20. And yeah, it will still show the 20. And when I update it to 23 in this tab, and I'm going to reload this in this tab, it is going to show 23 as well. So this is very nice. If you want to store things, you will probably want to preferably use local storage instead of session storage. I would personally use session storage only for things that you don't want to store too long, but you still want to store them longer than a page view using a computed variable. But if you want to store something for a longer period of time, we're talking about days here in your browser, you want to use local storage. But right now, let's just revert this back to computed, so it always loses track if we reload that. Now, as you can see, we have some content flashing. You see, we see like for a split second, we see this original Webflow text, because Wized is a script, Wized is a functionality layer that is loaded on top of your Webflow website. So it takes a little bit to load. While Wized is loading, we want to not show this text. So what we want to do is we want to use Wized cloak. Let me just copy Wized cloak here. And we want to put it on the header code. What Wized cloak is doing is it is just a CSS style, basically. So everything that will have the data attribute of Wized cloak on the published site will be set to visibility none. And Wized, once it gets initialized, so actually, why can't I save this? Okay. So once Wized is initialized, so let's say it is hidden, right? And the moment Wized gets initialized, it is now actually trying to activate the hidden component. The component is still on the canvas. It is just CSS styled hidden. But now, since Wized is actually by the attribute when it wants to load the text, right? We have the text, the placeholder. And while Wized now wants to add the 0 in the text, it needs to access the component. It needs to say, you know, this component with this attribute, I have to put my 0 in here, right? So while Wized is putting the 0, it is automatically removing the class of it initially being hidden because it needs to access the component, and therefore we don't have this content flashing because the component is initially hidden, and only the moment when Wized wants to set the text, so Wized is already loaded, it already has the data, it wants to set the text in it, that's when this component becomes visible. And this is what Wized cloak is doing. And in order to get this on this component, and it always needs to be on the component that you're setting the action with, you cannot have this on the canvas or the section if that is not related to any action. It always needs to be on the one that has the action. But you just need to add a data attribute here, as I just did, of Wized cloak, and add the code on the header code. And now we will see we will not have any content flashing. That will prevent the whole content flashing and give us a content flashing free experience. You see? Wonderful. So now we still have some moving parts around, and that may be not so nice for the UI experience. So what we could do here is, since, as you can see, the button is moving funky around like this, that means because when there is no text in here, it doesn't have any height on the published version. So what we could do is we could just set a minimum height to 44 pixels, like the height of the topography. Right here, this would be our minimum height. And now, since we set the minimum height to 44 pixels, we should not have this funky moving around, or not have it too funky. Actually, since we now have Wized cloak, I made a little mistake. It is just not having it on the canvas, and therefore it's moving. So the way you can get around that is actually having a div block, and let's call this div. And then set this, give this a minimum height of 44 pixels right here. And then we're going to get the text and put it into the div block. So the div block right now will have the static height, and even if this item is removed out of the div block, the div block still has its original height. Because, and then we just want to make sure that it also has some width. And let's do a minimum width of 2 rem, just to make sure. And this should eliminate this moving around as it initializes the dynamic data. As you can see, it's wonderful. Look at that. We don't have any moving parts going on. And you always want to make sure, as I didn't do it in here, that we have flexbox centered applied to it on a vertical position, just so that it doesn't look funky. And yeah, this is how we're going to get around this content flashing, and how we're going to get around the content moving, which nobody really talks about, but it's very important. You don't want your whole page to just collapse and expand as it loads the data. So you want to add a container holding those dynamic fields around them, just to make sure to give them a minimum height that they don't collapse. Because if an item in HTML has no content in it, it's nothing. It just doesn't have any width, doesn't have any height, right? It's like a hidden element. And therefore it will change the way the format on the website is being shown. So when you work with Wized, you don't not just only have to think about logic, but you also have to think about how the logic that you're building is affecting the static side. Because if I would just remove this thing from the canvas, and let's say I would just remove this whole div from the canvas, you see it just moved up. So we know this, since it has Wized cloak, will be removed from the canvas to avoid content flashing, right? And we want to build it that way that when it is removed, we still have the format as it is. And this is why we need to think about, for example, adding a div block in here, holding the text, set with a minimum height to make sure that the alignment of the content as the data gets loaded and as we interact with the components is always the same and is always a smooth experience. Yeah, and those are basically the fundamentals of working with Wized. This is the basic knowledge you need to know to get started with Wized, working with Wized. Not talking about databases yet. This is only about Wized. You can build this functionality, the calculator, whatever, without a database. You don't need to have a backend to do that, because those things can be run on your user's computer, on their mobile device. Mobile devices, computers are very powerful nowadays. So if you don't need to have the data stored on your database, you can do those things and more and much more on the browser without the need of having a backend, right? This is where Wized really gets powerful too. You can add those functionalities to your site without the need to have a third-party service, without the need to have Zapier, without the need to do this, and that. You can build this without a backend on Wized. This is only Wized functionality we did today. Now, if you want to send the number to the backend, you could do that, right? But if you only want to store the number, for example, under local storage, Wized can do that without a backend. If you want to store the number in a session storage, Wized can do that without a backend. If you just want to have a computed variable where they can just add this number and refresh and it gets resetted, Wized can do that too. You can go more complex with that. Now, if you want to send that data, Wized has something called requests, where we'll be doing another basic beginner video just about that. That is the other part of Wized. Today we only talked about the logic part of Wized. Now, in the other part, we will be also using the logic to do requests to the backend to extend the way we can do the logic using third-party APIs and all of that. But just the logic layer is super powerful of Wized. And yeah, I hope that this really helped you to understand how Wized works, the fundamentals, the basics of Wized. And I really hope that you're going to build a lot of exciting stuff. And please let me know if you have any questions about Wized, if anything was unclear, if you need any further explanation about anything mentioned in this video. Please let me know in the comments, and I'm super happy to see your journey or you starting to tap more into building more and more exciting stuff, or maybe even building your first project in Wized. Yeah. And I'm just super excited to see that there is the progress, that from going to a static site now to web app development, and it's getting super easy using Wized. So thank you so much for being on this path. Thank you so much for being on this journey together with all of us. And yeah, I really appreciate you being part of the community. And yeah, please let me know if you have any questions, because this is where we are here for. We are here to help each other get better at Wized and developing. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate that, and see you tomorrow.